Welcome to GLD's Policy Roundtable on Gender and Politics in the Global South. I will hand over now to GLD's founder and director, Ellen Last, who will give us a brief overview about GLD.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, with a nice echo as well.
I'm so sorry. This has not been our morning, but I'm again very, very glad to join you and extremely excited about the panel. So just to give you a bit of a background on us, we're the Governance and Local Development Institute. And our aim is, as you can see here in the mission statement, to promote human welfare by conducting scientifically rigorous research across the globe. We basically focus on answering the fundamental question of why some communities are better able to provide secure environments or good education, adequate health care, and other factors that encourage and foster human development while others fail to do so. So we engage with communities across the world. We're interested in developing methodological tools, gathering data, undertaking analyses on major issues affecting societies today, and disseminating findings then to academics and to relevant policymakers and to the communities in which we work. So that's the sort of the goal of GLD, to give you a sense of how we do what we do. Sarah, to the next slide, please. Basically, we have several sort of ways in which we seek to achieve our goals. Part of it is through research. So we do a lot of research often in the Global South, a lot we've done in Africa and the Middle East ourselves, but we also are expanding globally as well. And we support the research of others, and that research has been done in Latin America and Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And part of our research leads to a lot of data, and so you can find on our website a lot of data that is publicly accessible in the hopes of helping others to be able to extend the research that is done on issues of gender, but also many other issues as well. We have a set of educational material that we produce and that we make available, and the sort of the Roundtable series is one part of that. We help to develop a sort of a scholarly network. We have fellows. So Anjali is a fellow with us at the moment, for instance. Marwa is an associate with us. We have a lot of different ways in which people can engage, and we have sort of policy engagement as well. And so we try to work with policymakers and others to make sure that the work we're doing extends beyond just the sort of the research realm. And the next, you'll see different ways in which you can actually help to engage or hope to engage with us. You can be part of the Work in Progress workshop. We actually currently have a call for people who want to have their research workshopped or sort of present work in progress and get some really, really good and useful feedback. You can submit a working paper to the working paper series. You can also use those working papers in your classes and elsewhere. You can be either a guest, or if you're interested in being a host, you should reach out on Governance Uncovered, which is a podcast of GLD, and we've had the chance to talk to a lot of both researchers and practitioners about the work they do around the world. You can have a fellowship, and those applications, again, are also open. Those are non-residential fellowships, but have a lot of different ways in which you can engage with us. You can actually work with us as interns or postdoctoral fellowships, or often we have staff positions. You can help to co-write and also use the executive summaries and briefs that we have. You're welcome to analyze our data and, again, use our educational material, which is available both in English as well as in Arabic. So we hope that these are some ways in which you might find it useful and interesting to engage with us, and we're always looking for new playmates. And so if you, again, want more information, you're welcome to reach out or take a look at the website, which you can find the website address here. But I want to move in now to be able to welcome our panelists and to talk about gender and local politics in the Global South. I'm super excited about this panel, in part because I was telling some people today of how many times I've been wrong about my expectations about what's going on with women in representation in the Global South. So I think I need to be schooled, but also really am excited about learning from you all. I'm going to introduce the facilitator, the moderator today. And then Allison, I'll let you introduce everybody else. But thank you, Allison Sambo, for joining us. Allison is the Director of Evaluation and Analytics at the Global Fund for Women, as you see here. She did her MA and her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where Marwa is now, and has done a lot of work on looking at kind of monitoring and evaluation systems and social and behavioral change, has done a lot of work on specifically on gender, and thinking about basically sort of how we can promote gender equality. So Allison, I'm really, really grateful for you joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here and excited to introduce our panelists for the day. Next slide. First, we have Safia Farol. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and Global Affairs at Portland State University. Safia's research interests include local politics, party systems, and elections in Africa. She's published articles in several journals, and in the 2022 and 2023 academic year, she was awarded the Craig Woolner Memorial Award for junior faculty, which recognizes excellence in research and teaching by one junior faculty member in the College of Urban and Public Affairs at PSU. In 2021 and 2022 academic year, she was the recipient of the American Association of University Women American Postdoctoral Fellowship. And in June 2019, she received her PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. Next slide. Marwa Shalabi is also from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Her research areas are gender politics, authoritarianism, and legislative politics, focusing on the intersection of legislative politics, authoritarianism, and women in politics in the Middle East and North Africa. She currently serves on the editorial boards of Political Politics and Gender and the Review of Economics and Political Science. She works as an associate at the Governance and Local Development Institute, and her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Politics and Gender, Comparative Politics, Governance, among others. And our last speaker is Anjali Thomas. Anjali is an associate professor in the Sam Noon School of International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. She specializes in comparative politics and political economy with a focus on India. The substantive questions driving her current research have to do with the politics of public service provision, local and multi-level governance, gender disparities, and distributive politics. She's the author of Democratization from Above, The Logic of Local Democracy in the Developing World. And her recent articles have been published in the American Journal of Political Science, the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, and Political Research Quarterly. The major ongoing projects Anjali is focusing on works on the pathways through which citizens gain formalized access to services and on the role of state actors in shaping citizens' pro-developmental attitudes and behaviors. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Marwa to bring us through some of her current research.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allison, for the introduction, and thank you, GLD, for hosting us today to speak about this important topic. So I think I will start first by providing some background information. What are we talking about today? Some definitions, and then a very brief summary of the context or the specific country that I'm going to present today, and then we can have more discussion later. So first, just to kind of define what we're talking about today. So what is local government? So I'd like to start, this is based on the UN UN Women definition of local governance, which is basically institutional units whose fiscal, legislative, and executive authority extends over the smallest geographical areas distinguished for administrative and political purposes. So this is basically the unit of analysis that we're trying to cover today. So just in kind of a quick kind of an overview about women's representation in local politics. So according again to the UN Women in Local Politics data set, which is an amazing data set that was published last year. So according to this data set, women represent about 36% of female of local office. This is globally where data is available. Again, local politics data is really hard to get. So where we have data, women represent about 36% at the local level, which is kind of compares to 25% in national parliaments. And you will see here, and we will talk more about this, this is why there's a growing importance and a growing interest in women's representation in local politics, given their growing numbers and increasing importance in this level of governance. So what we also know that gender quotas like really proliferated globally. So we have now about 75 countries that have introduced some kind of gender quotas on the local level. And 1/3 of these countries are actually authoritarian regimes. So we will find that, so the point that I'm trying to make here is that we find there's really not much variation between democratic and authoritarian regimes, where we actually find that both contexts are introducing more and more women to local politics. So the gender in politics and authoritarian regimes, they are very important and they're overlooked. And we continue to look at women in national politics, and we tend to pay less attention to women in subnational politics. And this is a major shortcoming because local politicians are the one who are most proximate to constituents, and also the fact that women also have closer or more needs on the local level. This is kind of in their everyday lives. This is where they interact and where they have their different needs through this everyday, we call them like everyday politics. Hey, Sarah, can we get the second slide? So, and then I just talking about the Middle East in particular, the Middle East and North Africa region. So I got this a graph from the UN Women in Local Government data set, where it kind of compares the Middle East and North Africa region to different regions. So we have here that MENA is the lowest regions in the world when it comes to women's local representation, even when compared to other regions like in Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. Come in, that's fine. When we come to compare to other regions like Asia or Northern America and Europe, still the Middle East is the least represented in all the regions. So this is also across the Middle East, there's so many variations where women are only represented in the local level in some countries, like thinking about Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and before 2021. So women are only represented on the local level and not necessarily on the national level. And also if we look at the case of Palestine, where women are only represented in the local level. In addition to these variations, there's also so many variations on the regional level in quota adoption and representation. So for instance, when it comes to Tunisia, we have like 48% of women in these local councils compared to only 4% in Lebanon and like 3% in Oman. So the point here that there's so many variations that we're not really accounting for and understanding fully, and needs more work and research throughout the MENA region. And then I want to move to more specifically to the case of Morocco, and this is like a working paper that's now published through GLD, is working paper number 48. Which actually focuses particularly on the case of Morocco, and this paper is about how women get to win seats beyond the quota seats. So we have here kind of some information, kind of a general information about Morocco, and I'm happy we will talk more about this specific case in the rest of our discussion. So for the case of Morocco, gender quotas were introduced in 2009. So we had 12% local gender quota. In 2009, as I said, and then it increased in 2015 to 30%. So one of the main findings of this specific paper that there is no evidence that party ideology matters for women's winning more seats more than the gender quota seats. So the whole paper is about what happens, what are the chances, or what are the correlates of women winning more seats than the gender quota seats. So one point that we find in this paper is that, Sarah, can you go to the next slide? I just want to show the graph to show so one point that we find in this paper that over time, gender quotas did increase women's representation in both local and national levels. So the trends are that you see like there's an increasing trend in women's representation. So by 2020, there was about 27%, 28% of women in local politics, and 2% in national politics. So the point is, gender quotas did increase women's representation, but the question is, how can women win seats beyond these gender quota seats? And this is what we explore in the working paper number 48 through GLD. Sarah, please go back to the slide. No, the one before. Yeah. So again, the finding is that when women get seats beyond gender quotas, we do find no evidence that party ideology matters. So the leftist or the Islamist parties, they field women equally. And the women are disadvantaged from getting additional seats across parties. But we also find that women have advantage in districts with proportional representation. So PR systems, like very, very similar to democracies, women are more likely to win more seats in PR districts, which tend to be more urbanized, more economically developed, with higher levels of education. And also how the majoritarian electoral system, or the SMDs, they tend to favor males. So we have men always, because they're more connected, they're capable service providers in voters' eyes, and that's why they kind of advantage men over women in these single member districts. And also how voters demand, one of the main findings that we find in this paper, and I think we've done something that we can build on for the rest of the discussion, how voters' demand for service limits women's success beyond gender quota seats. So it's always this kind of the clientelism and corruption, and how it kind of motivates voters to vote more for men, with this idea that men are more capable service providers. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I will stop here for my next speaker, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Marwa. That was a super useful overview of the MENA region. I'm going to transition to talking about sub-Saharan Africa, which is my region. And to do so, I'm going to first give some broad overview of the trends that we are seeing in women's representation on the continent by comparing women's presence in national and local bodies. And so the figure I have here is showing data that is comparing the top 10 countries that have the most number of women in national parliaments where data is available in Africa. And it's comparing their percentage of women that are also in local bodies in those countries. And I mean, as you can see, there are some countries that are very well known in Africa for having a large presence of women in politics. Rwanda being a front leader, a leader in that. 61% of the parliament are women in Rwanda currently from the latest election. And also Senegal and South Africa are very close contenders. They also have a really big, significant representation of women. But as you can see, the gray bars are showing the percentage of women that are in local politics. And in almost all the countries, you can see that there's a gap. With the exception of Senegal and Namibia, there are fewer women on average that are in local government in African countries compared to the national. And that gap is very pronounced in countries like Zimbabwe, where 31% of parliament is women. And on the other hand, 12% of women are 12% of local councillors are women. And so, and the gap just grows wider as you look at other countries in the sub-Saharan Africa region. And so, the success of women in national parliaments in Africa, a lot of that is due to the use of proportional representation systems, as Marwa had talked about, in addition to the presence of quotas, gender quotas. And so in a lot of these countries that I'm showing you here in the top 10, they either have a PR system or they have a gender quota policy that has considerably helped to increase women's presence. And there's also considerable variation in the adoption of quota policies at the local level too, which I'll talk about next. Sarah, if you can please go to the next slide. So at the local level, similar to national politics in sub-Saharan Africa, there are several types of quotas that are very common. Some countries either have reserved seats for women, like they set aside a certain number of seats that in which only women can contest, or they have candidate quotas where they have certain ranking requirements that women have to sort of be distributed equally on the candidate lists, and those are also very common. And there's also variation in the percentage of women that are required to be represented in the quota system. Some countries have 25% requirement in the case of Niger, and other countries have 50% requirement. There has to be an equal representation of women and men on candidate lists. So that would be countries like South Africa, Senegal, for example. And of course, with this comes the extent to which this is enforceable by law, right? There are certain cases where the quotas are not enforceable by law. They are voluntary, right? Political parties can choose to adopt them, or they can choose to disregard them. And so even within individual countries, you see considerable variation in the adoption of these policies. I also want to make the point that the quota policies exist alongside the electoral rules that countries use to elect politicians. And that this also determines the extent to which the quota is effective. So you have some countries that have plurality rules, first past the post elections. And in these cases, a lot of times they adopt reserved seats. So I'm thinking about the example of Tanzania, for example. Tanzania has a first past the post electoral rules, and they have reserved seats for women. Similarly, Kenya has also recently adopted this. But in countries that use proportional representation, whether it's closed lists or open lists, a lot of times the type of quota is related to the ranking of candidates. So they typically have a candidate quota system. And so here you see the case of Rwanda, South Africa, and similar countries that use PR. You also have some countries that use a hybrid of electoral systems locally. Some seats are based on plurality, and others are based on, for example, PR. And this is sort of the best of both worlds. And it's actually the system that South Africa uses locally, which is relevant to my next slide. Please, Sarah, next slide. Yeah, so just to drill down a little bit deeper, I'm going to discuss the case that my research is on, most of my research, which is South Africa. At the local level, South Africa has a legislated candidate quota policy. By the Constitution, parties have to seek to ensure that 50% of candidates on party lists are women. And so, however, when I say that they have to seek to ensure that, it means that there's no legal sanctions for non-compliance. And so there's not a strong enforcement mechanism in place. But on top of this, individual parties can decide to adopt voluntary party quotas. And we see that with the case of the largest party in the country, the African National Congress Party, which in 2006, the 2006 local government election, they adopted a 50% quota policy, where 50% of candidates on the PR list have to be women. And South Africa, as I mentioned, uses a mixed electoral system locally. And as you can see in the data that I'm showing here, there's a discrepancy between the percent of women that are elected using PR and those that are elected using the plurality rules, which are referred to as ward seats in South Africa. And so in gray, you can see that fewer women are elected through first past the post electoral rules compared to PR. PR is consistently the system that I collected for the last 5 local government elections in South Africa.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I sorry to hear that Safia's portion was interrupted. I was very interested to know more about those patterns. But I'm going to talk about India, which is where the bulk of my research focuses. So next slide, please. So first I'll give you, so you've already heard a lot about kind of worldwide patterns. And so I will just draw your attention to the fact that in India, even compared to regional representation at the national level, India is really low. Currently, its national parliament has only 14% of women. There was, however, late last year, finally, after many, many years of kind of debating introducing women's quotas at the national level, or reservations, as they're called in the Indian context, there was finally legislation passed late last year to introduce a 33% seat quota at the national level. That has yet to be implemented. For those of you following, of course, there's the national elections coming up, but they're not going to be implemented in this round of elections. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. At the state level, it really varies from 0% to 18%. And I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of some of my research from the state of Bihar, which is in the north of India. And Bihar is at about 10% at the state level. And at the local level, though, there was a constitutional amendment in 1993, which mandated that at least 33% of seats in all states be reserved for women in local bodies. And Bihar, which is the state that I'm going to talk to you about, has 50% reserved for women at the local level. Next slide, please. So there's been a ton of research on the impact of local gender quotas in India. They've been found to, promote public goods provision, improve citizens' attitudes towards local leaders, and break down gender stereotypes. This is, work by Beeman et al. And co-authors. The Banerjee and Duflo piece talks about how, women-led village councils actually have a great impact on, providing public goods that women actually want. There's some very interesting work by Tanushree Goyal that shows that that having women at the local level increases the number of female activists at the local level, who in turn are better able to mobilize women voters. And there's a bunch of work showing that, even when it comes to higher level politics, that local gender quotas increase promotion, party renomination, candidate entry, and the electoral success of women in higher levels of government. So next slide, please. So where my work comes in, and this is co-authored with Charles Hankla, Shayan Banerjee, and Arindam Banerjee, we want to look at a different channel through which local gender quotas might improve women's electability at higher tiers or not improve it, as the case may be. And we want to look at the channel of voters' preferences. So in other words, when voters see a woman elected through a quota at the local level, does that make them more or less likely to prefer a woman running for state level elections? So that's kind of our research question. And we use a conjoint survey experiment in the state of Bihar that I just talked about. And I can say more about our sampling and research design and things like that. But I just want to, if anyone has questions in the Q&A, but I just wanted to highlight a few things that are of interest to this specific panel. One is, interestingly, we actually don't find really any difference in between reserved and non-reserved seats in terms of whether the village council head, who may be a reserved woman or a not reserved woman or a man, is actually approached by one of their constituents, or whether they're perceived as effective. So that is really interesting and encouraging. It kind of is a little bit different than what we might expect, given that, women are still perceived, women leaders at the local level are still perceived, and I can talk about this more later, but, kind of as not having complete autonomy from their male relatives. The big gender difference we see, which is not the main point of our paper, but could be something interesting to pick back up on, is the main difference we see is in terms of male and female constituents. Male male constituents are just much more likely to approach their local village head, regardless of whether it's a male or female, or whether it's a reserved seat or not. So that is pretty interesting. But the hypothesis that we were trying to look at in this paper is whether, if a local woman head is perceived to be effective at problem solving, perceived at being effective at addressing challenges within their village, does that make these potential voters more likely to vote for a female candidate at a higher level, right? So does that kind of positive assessment of women translate to their assessment of higher level women candidates? And we actually find no evidence of that. So, so in this conjoint survey experiment, even if you were exposed to a quota woman, let's say, and you thought that the woman was really effective, this did not actually increase your likelihood of preferring a female candidate for state level elections. Next slide, please. But interestingly, what we do find, and this is more of an exploratory result, but I'll just kind of put it out here, is that there is some evidence of a backlash of these local gender quotas for some subgroups of men. And we call these men partially progressive men, because in the absence of local gender quotas, they prefer a state-level female candidate over a state-level male candidate. But when they're exposed to local gender quotas, that exposure actually erases that preference. And so I can say more about this result if anyone is curious. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight too, since there was some discussion about party ideology. Marwa mentioned this as well. In the Indian context, party ideology, this is from a paper a recent paper in the AJPS with the same co-authors, where we look at how political party affiliation affects the electoral success of different women from different ethnicities, and in the Indian context, caste. And we find this interesting relationship where what we call ethno-nationalist gender norms, so ethno-nationalist parties really undermine the electoral success or electoral popularity of women who are actually elite, who belong to their own constituency. And we show evidence, and we argue that this is a function of ethno-nationalist gender norms, which essentially are patriarchal norms associated with the ethno-nationalist party's ideology, targeted towards their own women, in a sense, women in their core ethnic constituency. So I wanted to highlight this because I'm curious to know if people have perceptions of this in other regions and areas too. But that is it for me, and I'm looking forward to the broader discussion.
Thank you, panelists. And we'll start with some discussion, and we'll start with Safia actually on this first question. Hopefully your internet it has caught up and we can hear more about your work. So the question for the group today is really, and I think you spoke on this both at a regional level and contextualize this in these country level examples, but how would you characterize the status of women's participation in local politics in the context? Thinking in some of these cases, I know that there is a subnational gender quota system in place. And some of these cases, we've also heard about some of the effects that we've been looking into, such as how it's translated into seats beyond the quota, or how it's translated into higher levels of, or in higher levels of government. And so if you could briefly describe some of the gains or losses that may have occurred following the introduction of the gender quota, and what the main gains are, if any, with regard to women's participation in the last decade.
Hi,
And we'll go
Allison.
ahead and
Thank
start with Safia.
you for that follow-up. Can you hear me? Okay, you can hear me. All right, that's interesting. I did not get a message from Zoom about my connection, so apologies for that. But thank you for repeating this question. It's super helpful. As I was going over earlier, there's been considerable gains with the introduction of the local quota policy in the case of South Africa. And the data I was showing clearly indicates that, in particular for PR seats, women have achieved a lot more representation compared to the district elections, where they use plurality rules. And so in the case of South Africa, there's definitely been a lot of progress there. And in fact, the research I was going to share looks at why we see this gap between women's presence in plurality seats versus PR. And in the research that I've published recently, we look at sort of explaining the sources of that and the role of parties and their biases about having women be in certain type of positions locally, and sort of the discrepancy around that. In addition to like sort of what do these electoral rules, what do they represent within the broader political system? There's certain types of values that are attached in the case of South Africa to PR counselors as opposed to plurality counselors that are elected through districts, and sort of the connection to the national level party elites and how being a PR candidate and how that benefits women, at least locally. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of gains that have been made. There's also a lot of slow progress when it comes to women's elections in certain types of seats. And I've just looked at this in the case of South Africa, but this is also consistent in many other African countries that use plurality rules, right? We see a lot of the biases that are magnified within that type of electoral setup. And I also heard echoes of this in other the research of other presenters too, and I'm happy to talk about that some more going forward.
Thanks, Safia. Maybe we'll turn to Anjali, because I know we kind of ended your presentation on some of these biases and the designation of males as progressive, partially progressive.
So sorry, can you tell me what exactly what was the question again?
Yes, so we're working through the question of kind of briefly describing the gains or losses following the introduction of gender quotas, and really how they relate to women's participation. And I think building off of Safia's ending around biases and how that might also be important in this question.
Perfect. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah. So there's been, as I mentioned, a lot of work on the effective local gender quotas in India, and a lot of it, kind of showing that, while initially male, constituents are quite biased against women, eventually they, kind of as they observe more women in power, try to, that bias in a way gets attenuated. In my work with my co-authors in Bihar, it was interesting because we didn't see, a real difference in perception between males, for voters, between, quota women versus non-quota women or versus male representatives. But the backlash idea that we uncovered was essentially, this idea that when conservative, so-called conservative men, and we have this question in our survey where we ask men about household decision making and the extent to which females participate in the decision making, and so males from households where female decision making autonomy was really low, they didn't have any preference for a state level female candidate to begin with. And so if they were exposed to local gender quotas, they really, it really made no difference. They still didn't want women at the state level. But for these men who we call, partially progressive, who had some limited amount of female autonomy in their households, they, also in other results we showed, these results also pertain to some degree to men who are younger. They kind of, all else equal, preferred a state level female candidate, but when they were exposed to local gender quotas, this preference got erased. So, we've sometimes joked about calling this paper Too Many Women, because when there's already a woman in local, in a local position of power, men say, okay, that's enough. We don't want an additional woman at the state level. So that was just, kind of one example from the study. But there's a lot I could say about biases, but I'll just stop here for now.
And maybe then we'll pass to Marwa, that you can answer this question as well and build upon Anjali and Safia's points.
Yeah, I think thinking about the Middle East, it's amazing how there's so many synergies with our work. The three of us, kind of the work and the papers that we published. I think one thing, building off first what Angeli was saying, I think we find consistent evidence that males are less likely to support women in national and local politics. So this is the first thing. There is a huge gender gap in support for women politicians. So, and the other thing that we also find repeatedly in the Middle East with people with patriarchal attitudes are less likely to support women in both levels of elections, national or local. But you will also find these attitudes are more magnified on the local level, given the especially rural areas and less developed areas, less educated areas, less economically advantaged areas. You will find even these attitudes play a more prominent role. So that's why we're seeing more and more women are less able to get to this is the point that we make in the working paper. Women are less and less able to gain seats beyond quota seats because of, in a way, quotas are great. I'm a big supporter of quotas, but sometimes they also impose kind of a glass ceiling on women's success beyond quota seats. So this is what we're finding in highly patriarchal societies. So again, the quotas can let women in, but if the public attitudes toward women are not supportive, are not likely to get women to think that women are better political leaders, they can be an issue. And this issue can only solve by the parties, which becomes a more complex issue in settings where political parties play a less prominent role on the subnational level. Think about the Moroccan case. Parties really play very, very minor role. And that's why we're finding more and more ideology doesn't really play a big role in the subnational level in Morocco. They're all fielding women for the quotas, and they're all not fielding women for competitive seats. So it's not really an ideology story, but it's also about the parties are generally weak on the rural level, on the subnational level. So we're finding them less and less able, and they're not supportive of women too. So it's party leaders are also not supportive of women. So that's why we're seeing women being less and less representative. One last thing I will end with. This kind of we used to think in democracies, and my students are tired of me saying this over and over again. But the way we think about like in democracies that that local office is a stepping stone for women to get to higher level of office. It's not the case in the global south. In many cases that I studied, local office was not a stepping stone. These are totally different profiles of women. They recruit very different people, like local association women, work with charity organizations, like profiles that they would never recruit for national level. So in the most of the context that I study, this thesis is not true. That the being local office being a stepping stone for women, not really. So I'll stop here and we can talk more about that.
That's incredibly interesting, and I wonder if we can continue to build on some of these challenges, both in the context and what you're hearing across one another's work. And maybe I'll start with Anjali. So kind of beyond this talk of bias, maybe responding to other challenges, such as political parties, as Mara had mentioned.
Right, absolutely. So, so with political parties, I already mentioned this paper and these findings, where so it's interesting. Maro mentioned that political ideology, didn't make too much of a difference in I think it was Morocco, that context. In the Indian context, we find, and this is for state level elections in this conjoint experiment, we find that women aligned with the Hindu Nationalist Party, the BJP, who were upper caste, actually were disadvantaged. So there was a bias there, and this actually did not necessarily come from the party's core constituency. It came from lower caste voters, who we argue perceived these women to be kind of subject to these ethno-nationalist gender norms, which ran counter to their own interests as being from being outside of the party's core constituency. So party ideology did seem to play a role at this higher level. There's certainly work that talks about the gatekeeping aspect of parties. There's some interesting work that Raquel Bhavnani's work, for example, shows that when there's, quotas at the local level for gender, it actually helps party leaders learn about, the success of women. So that could be sort of one positive aspect of that. I just want to pick up on 2 points that I think Mara especially was highlighting. One is this idea of this quota ceiling effect, and I think we're seeing that in different ways in our work. I mean, I think you're seeing it in non-quota seats, and then I think in our work we're seeing that in terms of higher level politics, right? That there's something about quotas that are creating this kind of exactly the ceiling effect that you mentioned. And then another pattern that I think is really interesting, I think both in Morocco and India, if I remember correctly, local representation of women is higher at the local representation of women is higher at the local level than at the national level, and it seems to be flipped in South Africa. So I think that's an interesting kind of pattern that would be really I'm curious to explore and hear what people think.
And Safia, may I ask you to comment on the flip that Anjali was talking on?
Yeah, Anjali made some really great points. And, I think I sort of focused a lot on the role of parties as gatekeepers. And so I see that as a consistent theme in the research that we're doing. But I want to also talk about some other challenges that I've seen might be similar across contexts. There's the role of voter bias, right? I didn't hear us talking about this often, but in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, there's some interesting recent research that really shows a more sort of like a counterintuitive findings, right? Results that show that voters, in fact, don't harbor as much bias against women as we assumed. And so that's sort of been interesting because I think definitely patriarchal attitudes exist across many different societies and contexts within sub-Saharan Africa, but it doesn't always translate into voters not supporting women candidates. And so I think that this is something that perhaps in global South context, we need to probably understand, sort of interrogate our theories a little bit more to the extent to which perhaps there are other factors that they're taking into consideration. I would also add another challenge that hasn't been brought up yet is the lack of resources that female candidates have when it comes to election campaigns. This is not as relevant in countries where parties fund elections and they fund their candidates, as in the case of South Africa, for example. Many of the local councillors who are women that I've interviewed, they've told me that there's not pressure on them to come up with election campaign funds because the party covers it. But from other African contexts that I'm familiar with, especially in ones that use first past the post electoral rules, candidates have to raise their own funding oftentimes, or a significant portion of it. And we see this from studies that show that women struggle compared to men. They may not be tapped into sort of the more traditional sources of financing that men have more access to, for instance, from businesses, for example, or self-funding. So that's definitely, I feel like, a challenge that probably exists across contexts.
Thanks, Safia. And I wonder if other panelists either want to comment on the resources challenge and or talk about what's more unique you feel. We've talked about some of the common challenges, but some of the more unique points that we may not have covered. And I'll turn to Marwa first.
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to comment on what Safia was saying, which is really, I was smiling throughout because kind of the story of our life, me and Ellen doing a lot of work on gender in the Middle East, where we think about this voter bias. I think we do not understand voter bias, the structure of voter bias in the region and in many places actually in gender, in egalitarian contexts. So voter bias is very complex, actually. And it's not as simple to capture as the way that we thought, with the question of men are better political leaders as women, right? No, it is much more complex. And we did so much work as women as politicians, and actually bias operates differently when women are in power or they're candidates. So they're politicians already in, or if they're still running. So it's a very, very complex concept that I think much more work is needed to better kind of break down what is voter bias and what makes voters biased, and in which kind of election, right? And which kind of position too. Is a minister, or is she a candidate for legislative politics, or is she like a counselor, local counselor? So I think this bias is very complex and much more work is needed. So, and this is something that I just wanted to note. And again, me and Ellen, and we worked so much on this, and we're trying to pierce this, and it's really, really complex. So I don't want to go through all the things that we did on this topic, but it is actually very, very complicated concept, especially in highly patriarchal context. It's really challenging. Resources is a very, very important issue that Safia brought up, and resources are even much less for women running for local office. So we say resources are pretty poor for women in general, but when you even talk about subnational politics or local politics, it's even worse. I did so many interviews with local councillors in Morocco, and how they're saying even the most basic kind of resources for running a campaign, for having even like printing flyers or all that is not even, they don't even exist. And how it's really difficult to even fund their campaigns. And also one issue which kind of related to resources is training and campaigning. So women already struggle to campaign on the national level. So imagine on this local, very low visibility local elections, there are women really struggle with resources and also with training and campaigning and strategies. So they get in and parties pick them and they don't even, okay, what's next? We don't even know what to do next. So I think that this also much more magnified on the local level, even compared to the national level. And I'll stop here so I give others chance to comment too.
Anjali, would you like to jump in on this as well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I have anything very specific to say about resources, but I think that the Indian context probably echoes a lot of what you all are saying in terms of resource constraints at the local level. I think so in most states, the local level elections in rural areas are actually technically nonpartisan, which was theoretically supposed to be a way to kind of avoid some of these issues with political parties and funds getting involved. But in practice, a lot of councillors are aligned with one party or another. So that's interesting. But, something I wanted to, I think when Safia and Marwa both brought up campaigning, something that came out in some of our qualitative interviews was this idea that, women even can face constraints with campaigning beyond resources, right? Because of the norms, because of, being able to be in mixed gender crowds, being able to be out late at night, being able to go to, a police station, if need be, late at night, things like that. So I was wondering if anyone knows of any work that more systematically looks at that. And, that I think that's an interesting kind of dynamic that I haven't seen explored much. So.
Thanks, Anjali. And we're going to just have another 5 minutes on some of these panel questions before turning it over to audience questions. But I wanted to change gears slightly and talk a little bit, beyond thinking about women in these getting to these positions. How has their impact been in your context on shaping women-friendly outcomes or policies? And how do learnings from at least a decade of women's participation in local political processes inform your theoretical and measurement work? I know, Anjali, you had a slide there that talked about some of those outcomes, but maybe we'll start with Safia, if you could kind of think on with us some of the outcomes of having women's political participation through these mechanisms.
That's a great question, Allison. In fact, in my context, I find that women's numerical presence in municipal councils doesn't neatly translate to policy outcomes for women-friendly policies. And in fact, men in executive positions at the subnational level, they are still very much setting the agenda. So even if you have like local municipalities where there's a significant presence of women, if the provincial level is dominated by male representatives, then that's less likely to trickle down to policy at the local level. And so I've heard this also within interviews, right? For example, if women want to emphasize like access to clean water or school support for their children to attend schools, and they are local councillors, they may have difficulty like shaping that agenda if the provincial, the leaders at the provincial level are also not on board. And so there's definitely like there has to be alignment between different levels of subnational government, I feel, to grease the wheels in effect. And so in the case of South Africa, provinces and municipalities. I also feel that local political structures affect substantive representation. So as I was showing in my research, women are well represented, if not overrepresented in PR roles, but they're underrepresented as district councillors. And it's district councillors who decide on key service delivery issues in the case of South Africa. So the ward councillors are the ones who decide, who's going to get these job contracts to build XYZ in the municipality, or what type of schools are we gonna have here. And so because women are underrepresented in those roles, it can be difficult to really translate women-friendly policies to come about. And so I feel like we have to also pay attention to the impact of the local political structures that exist.
Thank you, Safia. And I think that's a good segue, I believe, to some of Marwa's work around perceptions about service delivery. Marwa, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I think I first want to note that, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, there is really very limited work on what women in local positions actually do. So for data it's very hard to get. We have the only source of data right now that we have is the LGPI data, which was developed actually by Ellen and GLD here, on that measured some of this on Tunisia, where we know some on the outcomes of women's local representation in the Tunisian context. So for instance, there is the GLD working paper 25, number 25, if you're interested to look at it, by Lindsay Benstead, which looks at women's counselors in Tunisia. And it does show some evidence that they're electing women counselors in Tunisia improves service and allocation responsiveness to female citizens. So kind of similar kind of what Anjali was mentioning a little bit ago for the case of India, but there is some improvement. We see that, and I think, but much more work is needed. So we don't know much about, for instance, in Morocco, the context that I study a lot. So I haven't seen any work kind of investigating what women actually do in local councils. But one thing that doing interviews was this local counselors, female local counselors. Again, we find, as Safia was saying, in the sub-Saharan Africa context, where women are, so I study parliaments. So the patterns of women's marginalization in national politics are mirrored on the local councils. I'll give an example. For instance, I study the national legislatures in Morocco. Women are always marginalized to less prestigious committees in the parliament, right? So, and I find the similar patterns when I ask female councillors in Morocco, so what kind of committees do you work on? And they were like, we are in the women's committees, we're in the sports committees, we're in the arts committees. And they are rarely on the finance committees or the budget committees, where like actual or infrastructure committees, which is the most important thing for these local voters. That's what they care about: the roads to their schools, to the clinics, how we want to get our kids to school. So infrastructure is an important thing, and women are rarely on these committees. So I always find this kind of patterns reproduced on the subnational. So women are in, and now what? So how can we strengthen the role and the outcomes of the representation? I think this is an area that we need to do much more work on.
Thanks, Marwa. Anjali, we'll have you last on this particular question before turning over to Q&A.
Yeah, so I think there's I think there's some interesting parallels here. And, what Mara said right at the very end, that we need more work, once women get elected, then what, right? And that's really kind of the big question. We do have some evidence in the Indian context that there are positive effects on service provision, but there's also evidence that, women are not necessarily, participating to the fullest extent. There's this phenomenon that again came out in our qualitative interviews, and it's actually kind of very well documented in the Indian context. It's called Mukhya Pati, which means the husband of the Mukhya. And it's this phenomenon where, voters, and I mean, often in actual practice, this is actually true, where the husband or the male relative of the woman local councillor is the one who actually does the work, and so it's sort of, okay, once you get in these quota seats, women, but then, is there a backlash because, women are not perceived to be actually doing the work and actually making a difference. And in that case, would we actually see more women-friendly policies? Probably not, right? And so I think another kind of aspect to this, and this is part of an ongoing project that I'm working on, is trying to look at women's influence on, kind of getting citizens to kind of, it's not necessarily public goods delivery, but so for example, with education, getting families to be more positive towards educating their girl children, so can women leaders kind of have an influence there, more kind of informally, as with regard to social norms, even if they're limited, as Safia was suggesting, I think that's true in the Indian context too, limited in really in terms of what they can do as far as making big policy changes. Can they have an influence on norms and kind of behaviors amongst citizens? So so that's to be to be determined based on some ongoing research that I'm doing.
Well, you've given us a great segue for the first question coming through the question and answer chat. This is from Aisha, and she's wondering whether the panelists have data on how women voters view women candidates. Do they too prefer men, or do they exhibit a preference for women over men? And I'm going to start with Anjali on this one, if that's okay.
Yes, sure. So, so in our conjoint survey experiment, we do find that women voters are more likely to prefer women candidates than are men. It's a small difference. We don't find overall biases with men either. So it's interesting. There's been a lot of work showing that you might find some different effects in the context of survey experiments as opposed to in the real world. But as far as the survey experiment goes, which can kind of controls for a lot of different confounding factors, we do see the small, preference for women voters for women candidates.
I would add to that. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, we have a massive survey that collects opinion data from all across Africa, and it's called the Afrobarometer, and it asks respondents, citizens, what is their opinion about women in politics and women politicians. And what we find consistently is many Africans support women who run as politicians across both genders. And so I think when you overtly ask people that question, they're in support of it. But as Anjali looks at in her research, I think you have to use some methodologies that sort of get at the underlying behaviors and attitudes, and maybe then it becomes a lot more murky. But in general, there's strong support across genders for women as politicians in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I would echo what Safia is saying too. Like so a recent survey experiment that we did in Morocco, it shows that women are very supportive of women politicians and candidates. There's a huge difference between women. So whatever bias we're seeing is driven by men, it's not driven by women. So women prefer women candidates and women politicians. And also in another, it's not a survey experiment, this is just a survey. So because Anjali was talking about some issues, maybe it was a survey experiment, so which we look at the results. But even in a nationally representative survey that I did in Tunisia and I did in Morocco, similar patterns. Women are more likely to support women. But also I think one thing that we really need, and that's a discussion that we can have after we finish with the Q&A, who turns out and why. So we find like how local elections, how people those who turn for local elections, they tend to be very different than those who turn out for the national elections. So, and interestingly, in most of the Middle East, and that's part of Ellen's book talk, the recent book talks about that, about how this local elections kind of a family business, and how that's why we're seeing very high turnout in sometimes in local content in elections versus national elections. So I think it's a very complex, and we need to understand more why people turn out in these local elections, and that's the key to answer these biases, and who votes for who, women or men, and what's the underlying motivations for voting. So I think these are all questions that are important to answer in our future work collectively, not just me.
I have another question through the chat that is specific to India, but I'm wondering if we can pass it around also within the Morocco and South Africa case, which is that do you see a difference in how women are viewed as leaders between the northern and southern states in India? And maybe for the rest, you see differences within the states that or within the countries rather, that you are working in terms of how women are viewed. And we can go ahead and start with Anjali and maybe pick up with Marwa, then Safia.
Sure. So, so unfortunately, the data that we have is from the survey experiment that we conducted just in Bihar. So I don't have, kind of very good kind of comparative data for you. But, my hunch is, and I think that is what your question is kind of getting at, that it is somewhat different in southern states. But, I think as Ellen said initially, I'm very prepared for all of my assumptions to be wrong. So I would be very interested to actually test some of those assumptions. But my initial hunch would be that we would be likely to see, men, for example, being more apt to support women in some of the southern states. But again, remains to be seen with data. And I haven't seen any, concrete data on that.
In the case of South Africa, I wouldn't necessarily focus so much on regions as opposed to the urban-rural divide, which I feel is relevant across sub-Saharan African countries and maybe even beyond. Clearly, there are differences in attitudes, right? Patriarchal attitudes tend to be more prevalent in the rural parts of the countries, where there's a sort of a different type of electoral arrangements in general. So in the case of South Africa, you have chieftaincies, for example, in rural parts of the country. And so you have one chief who's controlling a lot of the resources that are distributed. And in addition to that, they carry political influence. And so, and what I find just through my data is that women are represented more in urban parts of the country compared to the rural. I would also say that the role of parties is different in the urban versus rural. And so perhaps in these more cosmopolitan areas, it's actually a sort of a signifier of modernity and openness and inclusion to have more women represented on your candidate lists. And so in addition to, parties that use quotas, so there's definitely this sense that there's a divide along the urban and rural, whereas compared to rural regions that are less populated to begin with, there might not be such urgency to, for instance, try to nominate like district councilors who are female. Do you know what I mean? So I think that in my context, that's the more significant divide.
Marwa.
Yeah, I think everything that Anjali and Safia said applies to the Middle East to an extent, and how we see the urban rural kind of divide, that class divide, which is also important. So that also applies. But also then the weak role of political parties on the national versus local, again, that makes a huge difference in how women are fielded and how women are perceived. So that's all good, but it's also, again, as I was just mentioning, it's a little bit tricky to say so it's not necessarily that voters are not supporting women in subnational elections. That's going to be that's not true. but we don't know why they support them. Like there is high turnout and they supporting them, but it's because they are supporting a family member, a tribal member. So we just not understand. It's I think it's more complex than is this like women, male or female, and then the bias with the voters bias. It's more complex because we don't understand exactly why they're voting for a specific candidate. It's because of their family ties, it's because kinship ties. So it's the dynamics are different at a rural level, and I think this is challenging and interesting. That's why what makes local is much more interesting than national, because there's so many identities and so many motivations interact when voters make these choices. But again, all the patterns that my colleagues were talking about are very similar in the Middle East, where we're finding in the big PR districts, more urban districts, like it's very, very similar.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, who has a question for the group.
She thought I have one question. I have many questions, actually. So I want to start by just asking for a little bit more reflection on Anjali's sort of point where you were talking about how social norms restrict or kind of shape what women can do in campaigning, et cetera. And it reminds me of actually my own experience in Libya, where one of the things that happened was that there was a lot of pushback against having PR seats with a zipper quota in kind of rural and mountainous areas, and people were basically and they ended up actually reshaping the allocation of seats, right, so that many more of the PR seats went to urban areas, and more of the first past the post seats that didn't require the sort of the gender quota remained in kind of the more rural areas. And as a consequence, at one point I remember somebody saying to me, look, they want us to find women to run on these lists, right? We can't find women to go out and campaign, yet alone to go to Tripoli, right? So there is that sense, and so I'm kind of curious in terms of, do we see those norms being, kind of shaken and changed? We talk a lot about like changed perceptions of women and sort of changes in stereotypes, but does this also lead to, do we have any evidence that these kinds of restrictions on what women can do, start to get reshaped by having women candidates? So that's question number one. The second question I have, which again, and Anjali, so the first question, I'm sort of inspired by what you said, but interested in hearing about that across the regions. But when you're talking about, sort of the extent to which you have these sort of, what do you call them? Something progressive men, but they're like, kind of
Partially progressive men.
partially progressive, almost actually partially unprogressive as well, I guess. But so I'm wondering with regards to them, one thing that we found is in a paper with Lindsay Benstead and I have that just came out in CPS, but it's basically saying, okay, that we find women have actually, or women and men, but there's actually kind of a pro-female bias in the, I mean, admittedly imperfect evidence that we have. But one of the things that we had in kind of the qualitative answers that people were giving, because we asked, what do you think about when you think about these women, was that they were often thinking about the women candidates who are not necessarily coming in as quotas, right? So there's this idea that the women who were getting elected were somehow like even that more amazing because they were not only women, but they were getting elected, right? And so when you're saying, okay, well, then you get these people who are less excited about women candidates if you're going to have quotas, is it partially because they are thinking of sort of superwomen if they're getting elected without quotas, and they're thinking of, sort of maybe even the opposite if they've come in through a quota system? So I'm just curious as to regards to that. And third, and I won't belabor this, but Allison, I would love to hear your reflections on what you think in terms of from the kind of more the practitioner and policy side, where are, kind of insights and interesting avenues for future work? What are some of the sort of the existing policies that are trying to address some of the problems that have been raised? And what do you see as the most important next areas?
Do you want me to jump in?
Yes, please do. That's a big question, Ellen. I'm going to need a little
Sure.
time to ruminate on that one.
Yeah. So, with the first question about, the campaigning and sort of, and I would actually extend, with the norms kind of constraining campaigning, I would kind of summarize it like that. And I would even extend that to kind of norms shaping behavior while in office, what women can do while in office. And actually, I wanted to touch on that because it also relates to a question that Aisha asked about, the BJP and specifically the, kind of upper caste Hindu ideology in the Q&A. And, that it's sort of counterintuitive because these women who are part of their core constituency, our results show, are being disadvantaged. But we argue, and this is kind of coming from a few of our qualitative interviews, that it's exactly because of these norms that, lower caste voters perceive them as being constrained when they're in office. And so they don't make the ideal candidate in terms of, pushing development or something, whereas we don't see the biases towards upper caste men because even though they're not, like low, in the same caste as lower caste voters, they're able to make some of those, more, developmental changes and things like that. So just to kind of address that question. But in terms of the partially, progressive men, so at the state level in India, there's no quotas, right? And so, what we argue is that, and as I talked about before, the representation of women at the state level is very low. In Bihar, it's 10%. And so these kind of partially progressive or partially unprogressive men, are seeing this female candidate and saying, yes, we want more female candidates in theory, right? But then, and yes, they would be non-quota elected women, but then, still when they see when they're exposed to a local gender quota, and we don't prime them in any way to think of the local gender quota, but, when they're exposed to the local gender quota concurrently, that preference kind of goes away. So, so it seems to be kind of, driven by sort of this preference at a level where there's no quotas, in a sense. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Anjali, I want to add on to what you mentioned. I mean, answering the question about social norms that Ellen posed, I think in the case of South Africa in particular, it's not so much social norms, but it's violence. Violence restricts what women can and can't do in campaigns. And so this is a consistent theme I've heard from interviews I've done with local councillors. And this is a real issue. I mean, elections or local elections, they tend to be violent in that context. A lot of it has to do with nominations and disputes over nominations and who the party put forward in certain positions. And sometimes women themselves are targeted for violence because they're seen as like an illegitimate party imposed type candidate. And so that definitely restricts and affects the extent to which women can, campaign in certain areas. Especially if they are district councillors, because they have to be sort of the party of the face in a particular ward. And so, and as we know, like gender-based violence is very prevalent in some societies more so than others. South Africa has a high rate of gender-based violence in general. But there's also campaign-related violence that affects both men and women, but in women in a particular way. It's gendered, and a lot of it again having to do with feelings of illegitimacy and just being targeted for being put up as a quota candidate or whatnot.
Yeah, and I think also in Morocco, throughout the interviews that we did with local counselors, female counselors, social norms was a big issue. That where they always complained about how it's really frowned upon for women to be holding this public events and campaignings, and they have to campaign indoors. And also it's how men run these campaigns, staying outside and doing until late and doing all these night meetings, and this how parties, they just disregard the family needs of these women, and they continue to hold everything late at night. And even they said, even those who are in the council and they're being reelected, they said we're not able to be part of this male network because of the conservative gender norms. This men, they call like this boys club, they do all their business on cafes, and they network, and they connect with their constituents late at night in the social places, in the streets. And we cannot do this. We have families, and we cannot stay out at night and do like really do things that their society would frown upon. So yeah, social norms is an issue for women, especially in the local level where more conservative norms are dominant.
Thank you. And I can kind of jump in and try to answer some of, Ellen, your question around the practitioner sense. And for those of you who don't know Global Fund for Women, we are a global intermediary that both fundraises from philanthropies, foundations, governments, bilateral and multilateral institutions, and then we award grants to grassroots groups to support gender justice movements globally. And so I think, listening to this has both been a reflection of where does philanthropy sit in this kind of work? How have agendas, global agendas by multilateral and bilateral institutions shaped the adoption or ideology around the efficacy of gender quotas? And then kind of understanding how that meets the reality of how they're implemented and the outcomes and the shortcomings of them as well, I think, in trying to achieve what we'd hope to achieve. I think our work really has been looking at social movements and social movements as a mechanism for political, social, and economic change. And I think that really runs parallel to this track and also influences this track because a lot of what we've talked about today, I think, has to do with biases, norms, ideologies, and really the perception of women's roles in these spaces. And we posit in some way that in democracies where women have avenues to channel their demands in more formalized ways, through being represented in these spaces, that maybe social movements won't occur or won't be as blown up, so to speak, because these channels exist and they're functioning well. And I don't think we find that. And I think that this sort of reflects that there's an imperfect implementation. And just hearing these conversations, there's a lot of nuance to that that I think is quite interesting. And I think from the practitioner side, what we can take from this is a lot. But one of the things that's really stuck with me is something that Marwa had initially mentioned, which is that for these local candidates, their goal not necessarily is to reach the highest levels of government, but that is also okay. I think that really does have an effect or could have an effect. And we really have to think about efficacy within these lower levels of governance as well. And so I think that really reflects some of where philanthropy is headed in terms of trying to be more attuned to what's happening at a local governance level versus the national, bilateral, multilateral spaces that don't necessarily translate at that level. So I think I can bring that in from the practitioner standpoint. We have about 5 minutes left, and I know that GLD wants to also talk about the next session. So I'm going to stop us there unless anyone has a final comment or a couple of words that they'd like to share before we close out. I will turn it to Ellen.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Anjali and Safia and Marwa. This is absolutely fascinating and really, really appreciate your insights. Just to give you a sense of some upcoming events. So on the 9th, we have a work in progress workshop. As I was mentioning at the beginning, we workshop individuals' papers, and if you're ever interested in doing that, you can take a look and apply to present your own. But Perceptions of State Society Interactions for Local Development from the Periphery by Katrine Hofer will be on a hybrid workshop. So we do all of these hybrids so everybody can join in. And then on the 23rd, we'll have one about local administrative capacity, accountability, and budgetary information. Actually, just as I said that, I'm realizing that yesterday that ended up being changed. It's actually going to be a paper by Kate Baldwin instead that will be looking at the sort of religious authorities and distributive politics. So a slight switch from the schedule that we have up here, but basically both of them are very interesting, and you can always look at the calendar to see more. Sarah, do you want to move ahead to the final for us? Yeah, thank you. So basically just want to again thank everybody, invite you to join in with us. Also, I'll let you know that we are going to have the session's been taped, so it will be available on YouTube, and we will also be putting up the slides so we can see the Safia's sort of work that didn't get to be presented, but you'll be able to take a look at it. We'll have links to everybody's papers and a lot more information for you. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you.